Walter, you may have already mentioned this, but I wanted to mention that we've lost just recently 2 giants in this area of our work, and they've all been on your panels many times, and that's Nadia Duke and Ambassador Bill Miller.
Absolutely.
So we want to remember them and their legacy and their long years of work, starting in the early 1990s in Ukraine. Their legacy is very well established and very well known, and so we will always remember their outstanding beginning work. Second, we want to thank Walter for his daily email that he puts out. It's really amazing. You can count on a regular basis, and the man is loaded up with good material, and a lot of material which is hard to find, or you don't find it easily. And I thought he went a little beyond the call of duty. Adrian, when recently I got an email that said, "I'm sorry for my report being 6 hours late, but I'm hiking in the Himalayas, but I'll soon have it out." So we thank Walter for all of his good. Yeah, let's give him a hand. It's really a job to put that out every day. We're talking about economic security. As we all know, there's the defense security and economic security, 2 key factors in the future of Ukraine. And those of us in business, we like to say that the best defense against Mr. Putin is a strong and growing economy, because one of his strategies is to weaken and destroy the Ukrainian economic system. We always say the best offense to keep the United States and the European Union involved in Ukraine is a strong and growing economy. So we all know it's a win-win-win for Ukraine, and it's an area which needs still a lot of work. We just had a meeting last week up in New York with the president, and 32 companies were there, all of them very engaged in Ukraine. They want to stay in Ukraine. They like to do more in Ukraine. And as we say in the United States, it's the economy, stupid. So when you talk about economic security, part of it is the security the people of Ukraine feel, their pride in Ukraine, them having good jobs, them wanting to stay in Ukraine and not leave. So prosperity for the people of Ukraine is the bottom line of all this. So we have 2 top experts who've been engaged in Ukraine for years and years and years. Both of them hang out in the New York City area when they're not over in Ukraine or out running around. So first, Adrian and Myron have been on this program before. You're all very acquainted with them. Their resumes are in the program. So in this very area of economic security, it talks about the shadow economy, probably not the end of it, but maybe a reduction in the size of it. Fiscal policy, monetary policy, investment policy, the ease of doing business. All of those are very critical to economic security. So let's turn to Adrian first for your opening comments about this whole area of economic security.
Thank you, and good afternoon. I think Morgan has very accurately set the table. A thriving economy. There are all sorts of dimensions of how the direction of the Ukrainian economy will determine things that are related to national security, internal stability, and even the resources available for kinetic warfare, as well as the national, broadly speaking, the national defense. And there are a lot of issues that contribute to this. And I'd like to maybe first start with a little bit of scene setting, because we are here not simply as part of an academic enterprise. Many of the people in this room work on a daily basis to accurately convey the message of what Ukraine is, which way it is headed, what it has accomplished. And it's extremely important in a period where there's a lot of disinformation. That disinformation is augmented by Russian bots and Russian trolls and media that are largely ignorant of the use shorthand. And Ukraine's brand, let's face it, I think wrongly, is corruption, as opposed to courage, as opposed to initiative and so on. Ukraine's brand is wrongly oligarchs, as opposed to small and medium enterprises, and innovation, and enterprise, and an ability to mobily shift in the face of the loss of its major trading partner and the loss of 20% of its industrial and economic capabilities as a result of war, into an economy that in the last quarter grew almost at 5%, still well below what it should be doing, but definitely trending in the right direction. So I think it's extremely important for us to fight the myths that have been spread. Some of these myths have been spread with U.S. government funding for good purposes. These myths were spread to create pressure to reduce corruption. But what it created was an echo chamber in which corruption is the only message that's been echoing outside of Ukraine. And it's very funny that the whistleblower, Donald Trump, and President Zelensky all agreed only on one thing, that Ukraine is heavily corrupt. And that's an exaggeration. First of all, the myth of oligarchic control. 60% of the Ukrainian economy is powered by small and medium enterprises and individual entrepreneurs. There are 2 million small and medium businesses in Ukraine. There are 1.9 million people who are individual entrepreneurs called folks. Some of them are, let's face it, tax evasion schemes, but many of them are people who are providing services, who are providing activities as small-scale entrepreneurs who are paying taxes at a very low tax rate, very favorable to their development. Another innovation. Their contribution to the economy has to be recognized. 25% of the Ukrainian economy is the state budget. So when you add all that up, that's 85%. So the myth that the oligarchs control the economy. Yes, the oligarchs have had extensively over-exaggerated influence in the political process because of their television holdings and so on. But that has substantially diminished with this new generation of people who've come into power. Yes, some of them who are currently in power may have relationships with some of the oligarchs, but the vast proportion of them are people who have come outside of this existing system of power and influence. And one of the problems of the previous president was that he had to grapple with a parliament that was not under his control nor under the control of Arseniy Yatsenyuk, but was under the control of different interest groups that had basically bought their way into the parliament. And this president at least has the opportunity to move forward. We'll be talking about reliable access to energy resources, energy security, and so on. What I'd like to talk about are other directions. The creation of a strong investment environment. The Ukrainian Prime Minister has enunciated an extremely ambitious and probably unrealistic plan to propel growth of 40% over the next 5 years, with 5% being the target for this year. The last quarter that was fully recorded reached that target, but given the fact that there are signs of a global slowdown, that plan may be a little bit too ambitious, but it's a really good idea to have lofty, laudable goals to propel the society, to give it a sense of momentum. And Ukrainian society is currently inspired by the new leadership. It may not be in 6 months, but today 70% of people are happy with their government. They think the country's moving in the right direction. Compared to the United States, it's a very different, Ukraine has moved from being one of the most pessimistic nations in the world to one of the most optimistic, and that can also feed a little bit of energy. You were aware of the currency vector in Ukraine over the last year. The Ukrainian hryvnia has gained about 13% on the US dollar and more on the British pound. I don't know I didn't check what it did with the euro. The Ukrainian GDP, or the recorded official GDP, not the gray market and black market, is at about 140 now, with this currency correction closer, and growth anticipated to be this year at about 150 billion, which meant that when the government put its efforts to build the defense budget of 5%, it yielded 7.5 billion, whereas a couple years ago it was only 5 billion. That's an impressive forward movement of the economy. That's a story we have to tell to people. The country is still inordinately poor, but it has dodged a bullet, and this is a matter of its security. Mr. Zelensky was a bit of a populist in his very broad black and white definitions of where the country is headed. But he is an economically responsible, market-oriented, modern leader with a personal sense of honesty and a personal desire to move the country forward. These are good instincts, but so in a sense, what Ukraine dodged in this type of intelligent populism was the ruinous populism of other politicians that have driven the economy into the ground, caused it to lose its IMF support and its the currency stability and so on. Everything on the economic front is trending in the right direction, except for one issue, the big question of the global recession and a few glitches and problems that directly affect Ukrainian security. One, which will be talked about in the energy sector, I don't want to dwell on it, is the potential loss of $3 billion, not insignificant, 2% of the reported GDP, 1.5 probably if you add the gray market, of the loss of transit fees for Russian gas. Gazprom announced that they will only be sending 10 to 15 billion cubic meters of gas through the Ukrainian pipelines after the Nord Stream system is fully elaborated. That's less than the 90 billion, which brings Ukraine about $3 billion in resources and enables it to maintain its gas pipeline system and to subsidize improvement, but is a net contributor to the national economy. The other big gorilla in the room is the case of Privat and the allegation that $5.5 billion of Privat's loans were made to related parties in what the Ukrainian government has alleged was a fraudulent process. Now, it's not just $5.5 billion, which again is roughly 4% of GDP, 3.5% of GDP, a big hit. It's $5.5 billion that was brought into the bank to make up for the loss of that money that was transferred offshore to what the government alleges are related shell companies of Privat's former owner, Mr. Kolomoisky. The Ukrainian government put in $5.5 billion to stabilize the bank, and it would not be able, if Mr. Kolomoisky regains the bank through litigation, to remove that money as it is threatened, because it would bring about the collapse of a banking system on which 50% of business depends and 25% of savers depend. So simply, it's what happened in the U.S. There were certain institutions that were too big to fail. So this is an $11 billion question, and then you don't even go into the interest that Mr. Kolomoisky and the previous Privat owners were due to pay on the bad loans that their bank made to allegedly to related companies. When we take all of that into consideration, the other drivers of forward investment pale in comparison. Ukraine can probably realize a billion or so from a rapid privatization of some of these underperforming and corrupt state companies, smaller state companies. It can probably gain a bit of money, a couple $1 billion, like I said, from land privatization, maybe $1 billion from privatization of the state assets. But again, it pales in comparison with these other drags, the potential drags on the budget and on the economy. And more importantly, since Mr. Kolomoisky was a major political backer of Mr. Zelensky has to show his political independence. Mr. Kolomoisky, in my view, backed Mr. Zelensky because he wanted revenge against the former president, Petro Poroshenko, who, under Western pressure, went after his alleged banking schemes. There was heavy pressure from the international financial institutions, from the governments, and Mr. Poroshenko resisted for a while, but then he finally succumbed to that pressure and did the right thing, but making an enemy of Mr. Kolomoisky. And so Mr. Kolomoisky looked for other ways of getting back at him, and support for Mr. Zelensky through his major media asset, 1+1, was a part of this. So that's another part of this. If you deal with the Kolomoisky matter within the rule of law and pursue the various claims against him and reclaim and recover assets in pursuit of those claims, that will be a significant and terrific signal from Mr. Zelensky that he is independent of Mr. Kolomoisky, and secondly, that he is pursuing the deepening of the agenda of cleaning up the country and reducing grand corruption. Stable macroeconomic environment. There we seem to have a government that is committed to a rigorous budgetary discipline. They're functioning within the real world. The strengthening of the currency gives them a little bit more, I would say, purchasing power. The beginnings of the diversity of markets. The fact that Ukraine has nimbly moved. You know, if I asked you today to say what is the largest trading partner of Ukraine in the first 9 months of the year, I don't think any of you, with a single country, it's China, not Russia. Russia is now second. Well, okay. Yeah. But I'm not asking experts. I'm asking. Yeah. Anyway, but Ukraine is running a big trade deficit, but they don't have the leverage that Donald Trump has. Down the hall, by the way, I don't know if all of you saw the 30 cameras that are just half a block away from us as the U.S. trade representatives meeting with the Chinese delegation. Ukraine would never be able to have that kind of leverage in discussions with China, but things have changed dramatically. You know, CIS and Slovakia, what am I talking about? Exports just a few years ago, 2013, Russia was 35% of trade volumes. Today it's 15%, Russia and CIS, so 12% Russia and the rest other of those countries. And European exports have increased threefold. Ukrainian agriculture is a great driver. Ukrainian services in the form of its IT sector are not a great driver, but an important driver and a harbinger of additional. Ukrainian entrepreneurs have been, not Ukrainian oligarchs, Ukrainian entrepreneurs have been able to find their ways into these markets. They've figured out how to meet the requirements. They'll sell Shia halal, they sell Sunni halal, they sell kosher, they build markets in Nigeria, they're traveling the world with Ukrainian trade missions. All these stories we have to also tell. It's not as dark, it's not as deep as the consensus would have you believe. The country is not growing as dynamically as it should, but it's not that far from where it should be if there wasn't this echo chamber perpetuating the false image of what the economy is about. And that is an important part of Ukraine's economic security, getting the word out about the reality of the country, of the millions of people, small entrepreneurs, medium entrepreneurs, trying to make a living, trying to survive. If we can get that message out, we will help Ukraine in its energy security. And if Ukraine gets that message out, it will help drive foreign direct investment. It will help drive the opening of new markets. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian, for that outstanding overview of some very critical, important issues. Yes, the public perception of Ukraine in the international markets is very critical, and it's been very positive. We've got to keep it moving because a lot of investment decisions are not made by the U.S. company guys on the ground. They're made by their bosses in Europe and the United States who watch TV and some of this stuff. So it's moving forward and very positive. Okay, Myron, your opening comments, and then we'll get to some further discussion. Myron?
I'm on. Thank you. And thank you, Walter and McLaughlin. I'd like to start first. I agree with you, Morgan. I agree with you, Adrian. 100% on all that you have to say. However, I also want to temper that a bit. A, for the sake of discussion, and B, to highlight that it is an issue issue of information and what is out there and what, I was looking for that doohickey, thank you. If you want to use it, that'd be great. And it is an issue of perception. Adrian, you, as usual, hit the nail on the head in terms of the big economic risks that Ukraine is facing in the next year, even though I do agree it's on the correct, albeit somewhat sluggish path that it is on. And you're right. Transit fees, Privatbank, the Gazprom trading agreement generally in the future far outweighs whatever we're going to get in foreign direct investment. And I think that's a fact. And when we had, that is a homeland security issue, fundamentally. And obviously, as Kobolev from Naftogaz and the rest are already talking with the Russians about the future, and even today Kobolev mentioned that, well, we're going to have gas transit, and he's looking forward to that. So they are leveraging and thinking what they want to do. It's important that to note that in view of all the changes that the new government has done in terms of changing everybody around, what they haven't changed is the management of Naftogaz. Just not a good time to do that. So they see that they need that continuity, at least in the negotiation process. So it's a big, as you say, the big elephant in the room. This being said, Ukraine has to come to terms with the fact that transit fees will decrease, and there will be a gap increasingly in the budget. Because Nord Stream 2 will work, it may not be fully implementable in the first quarter of 2020, but by the end of the year, the capacity should be moving. So sooner or later, out of business, Ukraine has to think about it's going to lose money. And there's been discussions, and the big discussion on the gas transit fees, and then perhaps a topic for the other panel would be what Russia has often complained about Ukrainian gas transit fees, that they are too high. And if you see what Ukraine is trying to negotiate with the Europeans is to move the gas transit discussion to the Russian border, thereby letting the Europeans negotiate the gas transit fees, because that will be included or allow Ukraine to negotiate gas transit fees with the Europeans. Because if they're buying at the border, the gas transit fee is no longer a Russian issue. It's a negotiation with the Europeans, which is something also to consider and something they're leveraging in their discussions now. But I think one of the things we do have to address and are numbers, because we're talking about economic security, and it always is an issue of numbers and where we are and where we're going, and some of the numbers and some of the speak in the world and here in this town is quite negative. Now, bear with me. Where am I putting this? Who said that last week or a couple weeks ago? Right? Ukraine was a corrupt country full of terrible people. He said they tried to take me down. Now we know who said that. And that's a foreign policy challenge. And it addresses economic security, first and fundamentally. You have to counter that, and you have to counter that to that estate. You have to change the dialogue and change his perception. And it's great. It's a terrible, terrible quote. And how do we change that? We have, Adrian mentioned the cabinet ministers and their plan D and their plan of action. You can see that on the website. High quality changes taking place today. It's all in English, by the way. It's terrific. And you look at all these things. You're done. You're going through that. I can sit back. You can sit back. We can relax. We don't have anything to do. You just let the money trickle in. It's a great plan. The only thing is, somebody was criticizing it in terms of, it's not a plan, it's a wish list. And that will be the challenge for Ukraine over the next 5 years to actually implement that change. Because you know where you want to be, but how are you going to get there? And what things are going to happen to impede that process, other than Privatbank, other than Gazprom? And whether time, people say Ukraine doesn't have a lot of time. On the other hand, people are saying you need to give it time. What Ukraine doesn't have, in the long short, investors are going to wait. Why are they going to wait? Because all this is happening. But the other thing is simply we're used to waiting for the next Ukrainian scandal. Walter, just last year around this time, you were hosting a wonderful panel with Ukроборонпром. Now, all those guys were fired and they're facing investigations for corruption. What do we do? Who do we trust? And I'm talking like Adrian and our clients. Who do we trust? They were just out there as reformers. Now they're in trouble and may go to jail. So, regardless of the economy, a lot of businessmen are just going to sit and wait. Well, Adrian mentions, in 6 months the enthusiasm for the administration will change. So what does that mean? That means somebody's going to get sacked or some corruption thing's going to come up? And that's the narrative that I think is somewhat self-defeating with the Zelensky administration, in that they themselves admit that the enthusiasm that they currently have may wane. But it would be useful for them to say that, our main thing is not to wait for it to wane, and we actually believe that our enthusiasm will keep us afloat for the next 5 years. Because the view that they project, that we are in a panic to do something, otherwise we're all going to have general elections in a year, is on the one point true, but in terms of the public narrative, entirely self-defeating. That's not helpful. So, support, but encourage, and be realistic about what we actually have. Adrian, yes, we're on track with GDP growth. 4.6 is pretty good compared to where we were, and look where we were. We were at -16 in the summer of 2015. 0 until first quarter 2016. I mean, that's great progress. And moving on, look at the statistics. -14 back in 2009. Generally, GDP only averaged 2.64% for the last almost 20 years. That's not saying much. But comparisons. Russian GDP was only about the same. EU growth rate peaked at 1.30. So in terms of, you always have to compare apples and apples and not apples and oranges. So who are we comparing them to? We're comparing them to emerging markets. What is interesting, we've been below our peers, right? If you look from 2010 to 2018, emerging markets started at 7.4%. So that means everybody was putting money everywhere else but Ukraine, because we were at 2.6. But now it's down to 4.4. Where's our economy? Ukrainian economy at 4.6. So Ukraine's starting to balance out and starting to be level with its peers and may exceed its peers. And that's where I think the signal will be for investors to come in. Because, why not? Now it will be an apples to apples discussion. And I think that's a trend to see. The slowdown on the other emerging markets which is partly the result of slowdown in the global economy generally. But when foreign direct investment is very picky, and if the Ukrainian economy keeps moving up, it will outperform its peers. And that's a trend that we need to follow and encourage. And I agree, you know, it's really going down. So they're really picky. They're not going to be in a hurry to come here if we're going to have a crisis with Gazprom and with Privat. That's going to just completely negate those figures that we just had. And note, you know, foreign direct investment is not huge. And on the table, look at Russian foreign direct investment, you could use U.S. direct investment. But how much do they need? How much does Ukraine need? And again, as Adrian said, all those numbers, even the grand old days before the financial crisis of 5.9%, does not overcome the gaps that we were going to be having if those big pink elephants start barreling through the economy in the next year. And this only shows the figures, you know, who is, you know, average only $1 billion. That's all we get in foreign direct investment year on year. It won't fill the hole. And I think that's a record low of -40, but this is what we get. That's all we got. The biggest investor is the EBRD. But they're going to invest up to $1 billion, and they only invested $500,000 in 2018. World Bank's portfolio currently is $2.5 billion. Again, foreign direct investment is not enough. Ukraine has to strengthen its own economy by itself. And small to medium-sized enterprises growing and developing is the way to do it. Keeping that economic growth on course is how to do it. Because fundamentally, you know, people are still poor. I mean, those are the numbers, right? Russia is right up there in the red. Ukrainians are in the yellow. Purchasing power is extremely low. We have to increase purchasing power. Monthly salary, reported monthly salary, 3.85%. Where Ukraine is, where Europe is, you know, what purchasing power? Extremely low. Granted, we have a shadow economy, and going at the, I have a slide here somewhere. Oh, I broke it. Mini-Econ reported just recently that it fell to 30% of GDP. That's an official statistic about a shadow economy. So obviously it's not right. Because you can't monitor something that's in the shadows. So if the government's telling you it's 30%, it's going to be twice as much, or up to 50%. And in fact, that's what Andres Osmond was saying, is that's close to 50%. So that 385, you can double that salary. It's a little better. It moves your numbers up. It will be interesting if we get out of the shadow economy, how much the power of the economy would be increased just by legalizing everybody's wages. But fundamentally, Ukrainians have issues. Tax burden, you know, Ukrainians are complaining of what they pay. But that's a mental thing, because 18% is not it's not a bad tax rate. 1.5% military duty, that's the way it is. They're complaining about social taxes. Those are paid by the employer, not by the Ukrainians. And as you mentioned, Adrian, we have the private entrepreneurs who have a much lower tax rate. And you have small, medium-sized enterprises that are taxed at a much lower tax rate. So the overall effect of the economy, I don't believe, is 41.5%, although that's the message that seems to be coming out. So there's a public perception issue there in Ukraine itself that needs to be affected. You have to go out of the shadows. How to do that, that goes back to corruption perspectives, perceptions. And Adrian, I know that's all we talk about Ukraine. We've been talking about it for years, but it's right out there. I mean, look where we are. Ukraine, Liberia, Malawi, and Mali. 32 points. And in 10 years, Ukraine moved 15 points to 32 points. That's it. I know in 2020, next year, the perception will be much higher because they're always a year behind. However, we have to improve that. And that's the work ahead of Ukraine now. How to fix that perception, because I do think it's real. And I certainly don't want the Ukrainian narrative to be dominated by corruption. But it is being dominated by corruption, and it has to be addressed, and the shadow economy has to be addressed. So if we're talking about economic security, you mentioned the three big issues, two major issues of the Ukrainian economy being Gazprom and Privatbank. The additionals are the shadow economy, and we're taking it out of the shadows and legitimizing those incomes that people have, to raise the statistics and to reduce that and to elevate our rating in the perception index. And two, fundamentally, I think, overcoming this wait-and-see period that Ukraine has right now, and Ukraine and the government's own somewhat problematic approach to its, its 180-day plan, which is commendable, but presents a problem in perceptions that, let's wait the 180 days and see what that will happen, and that needs to be covered. So I'm over time. I'm supportive. We all think Ukraine is on the right path, but still a lot to do, and really critical. I agree. The next 6 months, through January, February, very critical periods in Ukraine's economy and its future. Thank you.
Myron, thanks very much. Very outstanding presentation. A lot of very critical issues there. We have the next panel is going to be on energy, so we won't cover that very much, but I do want to mention one thing: nuclear energy. Nuclear energy accounts for about 60% of the electricity. The nuclear industry has two major problems now. They're still far too dependent upon Russia, and it's aging, and they're not doing enough to modernize it. Only for 15 years, there's been various groups who've told the government of Ukraine, if you modernize your present reactors, make them safer, more efficient, more productive, it's equal to 2 new reactors. They're never going to build a new reactor. Have they done anything? No. Including the Poroshenko government, the latest proposals from Westinghouse to come in and modernize the present ones, and you have 2 new ones fairly quickly and cheaply. They've done nothing. Secondly, Russia still provides nuclear fuel to a majority of their reactors, and has a percentage that's over 50%. That's not security. Westinghouse could provide a lot more, but the government of Ukraine has refused because of Russian pressure to do more in the whole nuclear area, and their reactors are getting old. And this nuclear energy is a very critical energy issue, and it needs to be brought up by this new government. And Russia said, we'll build you a nuclear fuel plant. Of course they didn't. Russia says, we don't want you to build a nuclear waste plant in Ukraine, but they are finally doing it. Ukraine was paying Russia $200 million to take their nuclear fuel waste, and they were buying 100% of their fuel from Russia until the U.S. government intervened with Westinghouse. So just one comment about the importance of the continuation of nuclear fuel. Adrian, as you pointed out, the President and the Prime Minister, when they announced their agenda, it was like everything you've recommended, or that we've recommended, or the EBRD has recommended, anybody in the last 15 years, was a major agenda. A lot of it was, they said, a lot of it's going to be put in place, or at least some milestones by December. We all got to remember that the guys who are against all of that are not going away. They're well funded, they're well entrenched, and they play hardball. So we got to hold the Prime Minister to the fire to make sure they continue and not get sideways. And as you mentioned, the greatest thing that the business thinks is that the people of Ukraine spoke once again when they elected a new president. But then again, they said, we want to have a new parliament. So it's amazing that the new government got control of Parliament, and if they had got control of Parliament, this mood in the business community would be much, wouldn't be quite near as high as it was, because now the president has a chance to pass a lot of the legislation that's needed. So, any comments, Adrian, quickly about this? You said maybe a little unrealistic, but this great agenda that they put out there on the table, the tide of expectations, their ability to get it done, their ability to maintain control of Parliament. As you and I know, if you're a new government, you got to do some radical things. You got to have control of Parliament. Are they going to use it? Are they going to lose it?
Well, I think this is a very, if you look at the personnel that they've assembled, try to carry out these tasks, these are not people with sort of deep top-level experience, but a lot of them with substantial mid-level experience, which means that they were not necessarily caught up in special relationships with powerful and corrupt forces. So I think the ministers are a bit more independent, and the deputy ministers are pretty impressive. I think they are tilting towards a liberal, market-oriented economic model. They're making some mistakes. There's some criticism about some of their tax policy ideas, especially about these small-scale entrepreneurs and the impact on small businesses. So not everything is moving in the right direction. You had the resignation of the head of the National Security Council, although I spoke with him recently, and he said, my issues are my issues. This team is doing a lot of good things. So spoke positively of some of the progress that is being made. Look, if the global recession is soft, if there is progress on the Kolomoisky matter in a way that is conducive to the budgetary interests of the country and the rule of law, if it is. I'm not judging, because I don't want to have a lawsuit from Mr. Kolomoisky. I'm saying what the government has alleged. If those things are handled, if Germany, as Mrs. Merkel insisted, will support some kind of a proportionate quota of gas to pass through the Ukrainian pipeline system as a compensation for Nord Stream 2, and that doesn't mean 400 million out of 3 billion, but something much more substantial and equitable once Nord Stream is online, if it is online. Because remember, the U.S. and this president have actually been pretty tough, and the Congress has been pretty tough on imposing sanctions on businesses that work with Nord Stream. So when you factor all these things in, I think there's a possibility that we could get a bit better growth. But I still go back to the fundamental issue. I think I agree that the biggest problem in Ukraine is the structure of the court system, their inability to move quickly, to do findings based on the evidence, and to actively and vigorously protect property rights. That is a huge problem. It's also a big problem that there is substantial high-level corruption. There's no question about it, and rent-seeking. There is monopoly. There are issues of monopolization and the advantages that monopolies might get. And Ukraine has this 35% law. Any company with more than 35% of the market share, there are a bunch of companies that are over it. Fine, they can deal with it. They should deal with it. Those things could help create a bit more of a competitive market, and theoretically, they could create opportunities for foreign direct investment, because the government is not going to take away those monopolies. It will ask that they be sold, or that the owners shed those monopolies, and that process also has to be controlled, so that government friends aren't able to pick up at 10% of the value of the enterprise that is compelled to sell portions of its assets in a demonopolization. But the answer is, with land privatization, a modest recession, getting at Kolomoisky, moving the justice system a bit, getting the tax policy a little bit better. There's still one big thing, and that's the overhang of Ukraine's large credit burden to the West. And yes, this was the burden of former leaders that borrowed not just leaders to refinance, but borrowed from the IMF, and now Ukraine has a large annual burden. I mean, the United States has a big debt, and it services its debt in interest for its own internal borrowing. Ukraine has external borrowing. I think that's even worse. And and as a result, and also to keep control of inflation, the borrowing rate for small businesses is pretty high. It's like 15–16%. It's been reduced a little bit, but that's a huge amount for a business. You have to pay out on a loan, pay out 15%. I don't even know what the mortgage rate is, but it's dropped a little bit. But yeah, it's now like maybe that's right. That's the interest rate is about 60%. The borrowing rate is about that. So there's a lot of stuff that's going to drive. I think it's very hard to achieve the target of 40% over 5 years, which means 7% annual growth compounded. That the very young, very enthusiastic prime minister announced. But I think Ukraine can, if things break and they do things the right way and they recover some assets from a few dodgy cases, maybe and privatize some land and get some resources going from that, we could see the 5% figure hit in this year.
I think that's true. You mentioned a good point in that on the when Natalie and everybody restructured the debt back in 2015, there was the kicker in the negotiations was that once our economy starts growing, that's when your interest rates are low. But once we hit whatever above 5% or whatever it was, your interest rates increase. So the better the economy goes, the debt burden will increase. So and that's why.
So we're expecting 4.99%.
Yeah, you got to keep it another couple of years. You just got to keep it under that peak. That's important. But that's one of the things that the Zelensky government and the Prime Minister mentioned is they need to reduce the debt. And that's why, because of that kicker.
Okay, there's lots of positive signs. For as far as our business council, we can kind of tell how the winds are blowing. We've had about 20 companies actually in the last 4 months contact us about Ukraine, and a lot of them are not involved there now. And actually, the second largest privately held company in the United States contacted us a couple months ago. They built most of their plants in Russia, and I wanted to take a look at Ukraine, and we liked it because they said we want to be a member. Just tell us how we pay our dues. We always like those kind of companies, but it's been very positive in terms of the contacts that the business community here in the United States has had recently, and we of course hope that's going to continue. Let's open up for a couple of questions, then we're going to have to close off. But again, it's a very critical area, and lots of positive stuff. There's one more comment. We got to have a land market. The number one asset in all of Ukraine has not been used. It's a personal property right to buy and sell land. And it's not easy. They just can't all of a sudden tomorrow, let's pass some legislation. They could get it wrong. So with the new team out there, there's got a lot of staff work that's got to be done. There's a lot of legislation that's got to be passed. It's a very complicated thing to get done what they want to do, even if they've got the will to do it. So we've got they need a lot of help, but we've got to have a private land market that has huge ramifications for investment. Yes, question right over here.
Yes, thank you, Adrian and Myron, for excellent presentations. I was wondering if you had suggestions of how to balance these two messages. One is that you discussed that Ukraine is not so bad, not so corrupt, it's a good place to invest, and at the same time, to keep awareness that Ukraine is fighting a war, it still needs security assistance from the United States, and how not to deter foreign investors with that kind of messaging.
I think you don't talk at investment conferences about what's going on a daily basis on the front and the damage to the infrastructure and the towards although you could talk at a lawyer's conference about getting into the business of helping Ukraine win lawsuits against Russia for damages. That might be one way where you can combine economic investment and business interests in Ukraine and national security. But really, you know, you have several messages. The messages within the national security elite, within the foreign policy elite, and within the broader public is that this is a heroic country that's fighting for its survival. It's fighting to build up an economy that was devastated by decades of corruption, but it's making progress. It's fighting to build itself up from the legacies of communism, and it's doing it without the tens of billions of dollars that Poland had, and I don't begrudge Hungary and so on, but if you deducted that from their GDP growth in all those years, the performance of those tigers in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, would be substantially less. Ukraine has had none of the benefits, but all the disadvantages and worse. It's had a war. But I think that the way to talk is that there are targeted messages. It's not that you're lying about something, but you're showing one side of the country. But the overall arc should be that, you know, there's a heroic public that intercedes in behalf of justice and fairness every so often, and does it basically democratically, and sustains the country's progress towards democracy and tolerance. I think that's an attractive story about Ukraine, and the fact that, you know, the public is doing its own, it's fighting for itself, it's not asking anyone to fight, they just want support. It's asking people to invest, and it's asking for people to take advantage of the skills and the knowledge of that population. So I think a story around self-reliance on defense, self-reliance on economic growth, aided and assisted with foreign direct investment and you know, financial support from the democratic world.
I agree with you, Adrian. I also think those are also two parallel messages. You go to an investment conference or any of those business conferences, nobody talks about the war. It's a localized conflict for the business community, and as long as it stays that way, people look at it differently. The concerns are that it doesn't extend, and will economically end, will Ukraine tomorrow be saddled with all the costs of rebuilding the Donbass? Right, that's the other budget problem. But in the meanwhile, most of the time on the business conferences, you don't really talk about it. They really talk about all these economic issues. And I do agree that there's positive news on that. I think Ukraine loses in all of its public discussions when we talk not only about corruption, but about Steinmeier formulas, Minsk formulas, and all these things that to the investment community sound a bit complicated. You know, they're businessmen. I mean, you're either, they don't want a formula, they want a solution and a plan. And I think it's incumbent on the Zelensky administration to proceed, as Adrian, you mentioned, and everyone else, about the red lines that we cannot cross, but also how we want, what is your plan? That, I think, is a message that Ukraine has to convey.
Okay, we need to, close down there, just maybe a couple more quick questions, then we need to close.
Hello, my name's Sophia, and I have a question regarding, kind of based off of the investment idea, these two messages. When you're looking at growing like an economy, you're also trying to retain like human capital within the country. So what is the best way to retain skills within Ukraine and make sure people aren't leaving and we still have people working on like this investment?
Yeah, I think the reality is Ukraine has had a drain on its skilled workforces and unskilled moving to Poland and moving elsewhere. But if you look at what happened to Poland, even with a very high standard of living, the same phenomenon occurred. People will go from lower wage markets if the margin is substantial, if the gap is substantial. If it's, you know, if you're making 50% more, you're giving up your family, you're giving up your lifestyle, you're not going to move. But if you're getting double, triple, quadruple, you will move. And millions of Poles move to Britain, millions of Poles move to other EU countries. Even as their country was growing, it's a also faces a separate problem, which you raised, is demographic. In the the most productive age for economic growth is the age of between 21 and 45. Those are the people who are the most motivated. They're starting families. They're starting, they're ambitious to build their houses. We're over the hill. If you're under 21, you're also not at the game.
What?
But if you're over 45, you're coasting, basically. Anyway, the point is that only 20% of Ukraine's population is in that cohort. It's actually the same as China's and Russia's. These are serious long-term problems for sustaining the older population. That won't be able to change. Ukraine will eventually need additional workers. There are a lot of, but we've also talked about the unused and untapped domestic labor force. So people who live in the countryside go often to work overseas. Why? Because it takes an hour and a half to go 20 kilometers on lousy roads, where there's no electricity, there's no commuter rail system. So people are in the wrong places. Part of the infrastructure problem of Ukraine is finding ways of bringing people from smaller communities, not just suburbs, but outside of the city, to commute to the bigger cities where there are more jobs, but where rents are high so that people are not able to kind of come in and make a go of it. It's sort of, so there are lots of creative approaches, and it's not that everybody is leaving, but some people are actually in the wrong places, and the people who are leaving are the people who are in the wrong places, who are stuck in those places and who don't have that mobility into the cities because they can't afford the rent, but the jobs are there. And I can tell you, just one more thing. I renovated an apartment, built an apartment in Kiev about a year ago. So I learned all about where the labor people are, what the labor costs are. If you want someone to take down a few tons of concrete, you get people from Bielitsa who will do it at 1/3 the price of people in Kiev. But they have a truck, they'll drive it in, they'll do the work, and Bob's your uncle. The point is, there is a workforce that is available for certain kinds of jobs in the big cities, but they need to have the transportation and communications to enable them.
I agree, and that's an infrastructure and small, medium-sized enterprise issue. And what the previous government and this government are trying to do is also build up the oblast centers and the Raids Center, and build up smaller communities and the smaller towns, and not even towns, but smaller cities, because everybody is not going to be in Kiev, Lviv, Odessa, and Kharkiv. Like it or not, you have to make the rest of Ukraine livable and affordable for everyone, and that's when they'll stay.
Okay, and it's also very obvious, Poland's a great partner of Ukraine's, but they're also a great competitor. They put in all kinds of incentives in Poland to get people to go from Ukraine to Poland and to work there full-time or part-time. And other European Union countries are making it very attractive to try to get labor force out of Ukraine. So it's a major competition for Ukraine workforce and for skills. Final question.
What's your opinion about risk and possibility Russian influence to Ukrainian economic and need counteraction of this influence?
Well, it's, yes, this is an important component, but the reason I didn't address it in a more direct way was because the vector has been in the opposite direction because of the war. But that could change. And I think that one of the dangers, and this is a widespread view of many people in the oligarchic business community, and that is, hey, we've been able to make the shift to Western markets and to Asia and to Africa. If we get the Russian market back, now we're really going to start making money. And I think that's the danger, that there'll be a lot of pressure to cut a deal with Russia by people who are driven not by national security concerns, but purely by cash concerns. And I've heard this from some of these people in private conversations, so I can't say who it is, but it's a little shocking that they actually have a vision of like Janus looking forward and backward, east and west, or like the two-headed Russian state eagle, that Ukraine should be like that kind of a country. And I think that's extremely dangerous because we know that Russian intentions are on the line, and I think the fact that the Ukrainian economy is only
That's a good point. The only thing I would add to that is Ukrainians are working hard to keep that percentage of Russian investment low. But if you look to where the money is going, you look at where Ukrainian markets are developing and where the government is often taking trade delegations. We are Westerners, we're used to looking, we need to get U.S. investment in, we need to get European investment in, and it's great that we have the Ukrainian-European EU trade agreement, but fundamentally, Ukrainian goods are not yet fully competitive to make much of a dent in the European market. And Ukraine is looking very hard for other markets, including China and the Middle East and Africa. And that's where a lot of the growth in the Ukrainian economy will be, like it or not. Sure, I'd love to see, and everybody in the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council would love to see that everybody's trading with the United States, but it's expensive. The United States are far, and it has to be a really, really good product, because here it's incredibly competitive. So it's important to view and to encourage, I think, the Ukrainian government to continue what it's doing, is opening up those markets where Ukrainian goods are quite competitive and where there is a need for quality and less expensive goods. And unfortunately, that's not often Europe and the United States. So to counter the pressures of, let's make a lot of money in Russia, they're not going to counter it by making a lot of money in the United States. They're going to counter it by making a lot of money, India, China, Africa, and the Middle East.
Okay, Walter, 1 year ago when we met, Walter, none of us would have predicted that all the positive things that have happened would have happened. And all the major building blocks that are now in place to move the economy forward are really shocking and amazing, and none of us could have expected at this time. So it's been all positive. I mean, it's been this amazing, the building blocks that are necessary to get us where we wanted to go, they're now in place. So the major thing is the business community wants to watch what happens with the IMF, get that program going. They want independence of the national bank, and they want to see that the new government is using all this power blocks that they have to start producing real tangible results. So again, you have to wake up at night and say, yeah, it's really true. Ukraine has made all these great advancements. They've got all the deals in place to move Ukraine where we always wanted them, both defense-wise as well as economically and otherwise. So our job is to continue to support them and make sure they get the job done and full speed ahead. Thank you very much.